and thank you for the organizers for inviting me for this. And when I first got the invitation, actually, I was thinking of hate speech and the kind of work that I do, because I don't directly work on hate speech. So maybe just as Peter tried to make that link, I think hate speech, for me at least, is not the problem, but a manifestation of a problem which is much deeper. I think I would try to approach the topic today from that angle, and the angle of that being that it is something that is tied to our identity and formation of our identity, and how we define it in terms of exclusive ways and not very inclusive and tolerant ways. As I said, I just feel that we could search for cures after certain things happen, like you have discussed in your previous seminars, how to counter it in terms of all of that. But my approach would be a more preventive mechanism. So working on a much deeper level, on a more preventive level, on long-term education awareness and attitudinal change that comes from a deeper understanding, which leads to a formulation of our own identities in a much more inclusive fashion. And this is where I talked a little bit with Peter the other day about the difference between the concepts of difference and division. I think it's a simple topic, but something that we often don't really clarify within ourselves, because I think what we are mixing up here when we see in the case of hate speech, but not just in hate speech, but in many other spheres in society today, is that we mix up differences and divisions. So differences being things that are natural, like the difference in sex, for instance, the differences in the languages that we speak or the cultures that we come from, all of that. From that of divisions that are created based on so-called natural divisions, as in sexism or racism or classism or any other form of extremism that is developed as based on a certain natural division, but by bringing in a power dynamic into it. This for me is the basis of discrimination. And when you try to counter discrimination or attitudes of discrimination that often result in manifestations like hate speech, my research has been on how do we go back and start working on it from a more educational communication point of view. So the research that I've been doing with ICES on shared histories and shared sanctity, actually is the name of the project, has been looking back and tracing how in Sri Lankan history these different identities that we talk of today, or that you talk of in terms of Muslim identity in your last seminar, etc., how do we sort of go back and trace a very different narrative about these identities being formed. So in that, I will just share some photographs that I've taken from the field and other sources, and I have quite a few. So Peter, you might have to sort of alert me in terms of timekeeping and all of that if it's going on too long. So I might not share all of it, but I will try to share some of it. So let me see if I can share my screen now. Okay, share screen. Okay. Can you see? Am I doing it right? Or can you see a shared screen, a photograph, or not?
We can see you, Hasini.
Okay, great. Okay, super.
Clear.
Yeah, so I mean, the first image I want to present you with is an image actually not from Sri Lanka. This is now from Cambodia, and the image of Ravana. I just thought that we will start with Ravana because Ravana is a very popular concept in Sri Lanka right now, and especially has become a figurehead of the the Sinhalese nationalist identity in a most extreme end of the spectrum. But this is just to show you that even that example of Ravana, which we think is something that we can exclusively claim for ourselves as, oh, this Ravana is something authentically and essentially Sri Lankan, we find that it is not, and it's absolutely the opposite. And it's been obvious throughout, because Ravana actually, the figure comes from Hindu mythology and Ramayana, and this mythology belongs to the region of South and Southeast Asia. So during the times of the Chola Empire, for instance, in the 10th century, 11th century, where the South Indian Chola Empire spreaded all the way up to Java and Sumatra and included Sri Lanka as well as a part of it. These mythologies, these common tales, common characters traveled all over, and it came to Sri Lanka. It found home in Indonesia and in Cambodia, etc. So what we feel and what we try to claim today as something that is essentially ours, or Sinhalese or Sri Lankan, for instance, is in fact something that is common to the region. And it is our interaction with the region, what we contribute and what we borrow from the regional canon that we can see. So one of the first arguments I want to make today is that although often we have tried to think and imagine Sri Lanka as an island, separate from other entities, separate from the rest of the world, separate from the Indian subcontinent, South Asia, and other parts of Asia, we really cannot do so. So that is number one point. The fact that we always have to understand our own history in the context of the bigger region of South Asia. And we cannot simply put that aside. So that's the first argument that I want to make. The second argument I want to make is actually that it's a little bit more than the region. Sorry, here's another example about the region. For instance, if you look at the scripts that we are using, for instance, both the Sinhala and the Tamil scripts that we use today are descendant from the script called Brahmi, which spread across, again, the whole of South and Southeast Asian region. So it came from the main Asia body into Asia, to India, and in the northern segment, it went on to influence the Tibetan, the Hindi, the Gujarati, Marathi scripts, and in the southern, it went to form Tamil Grantha script. And then in Indonesia and Cambodia, it went on to develop into Khmer and Balinese and Javanese languages, even Laos and all these languages. So it's just one script that spreads across and becomes different things. And we actually inherit the South Indian version, which is the Tamil Grantha scripts that come to Sri Lanka and develop into both Tamil and Sinhalese scripts. So even if you really look at examples like linguistics or study the scripts and how they develop, you will find a lot of examples where there is no clear boundaries, where you can say, okay, this history is yours, this history is mine, this history is Sinhalese, or this history is Muslim or Tamil or whatever. I mean, we cannot enforce the identity categories that we use right now in our modern sense into the past. It doesn't really work that way. So that was just one example. The second example was that of making a call for contextualizing Sri Lanka, not just in the region, but also in a much bigger world. For instance, here is an example from the Anuradhapura Museum. So this one is called the Nestorian Cross. You can clearly see that it's a cross. We date it for about 5th century AD. And this, if you go to a museum in Anuradhapura, archaeological museum in Anuradhapura, you can see this. Of course, it doesn't make it to history books. It doesn't make it to mainstream media, or not many literature is written about it. But when you really find out how do you explain, because you know that the story that we usually learn about Anuradhapura is that it's a glorious Buddhist civilization. But then how do you explain a Catholic cross in the middle of all of that, right? And when you try to do so, you come across this whole idea of something that's not unknown totally, but the fact that by our strategic positioning in the maritime Silk Route or the oceanic Silk Route, Sri Lanka has been open not just to the influences of the region, but influences worldwide. You know that the what you see in red is the land Silk Route, and what you see in blue is the sea Silk Route, and we were really strategically positioned right in the middle of that. And because of that, we have been welcoming many traders, many peoples, many ideas and religions and cultures and languages to Sri Lankan shores. And so trade being one of the main ways in which moved people around and connected people, not just through empires or colonialism. Trade is also one way that brought people into contact with each other. And so, I mean, this is a figure of some of our ancient ports. You can see there's a port in the northern tip, Jambukola Pattana, Mantai. There are lots of archaeological excavations that have been completed there now. I'll show you some finds from it next. Gaul, Dondra, Godavaya, where we found a shipwreck, a very ancient shipwreck, and Gokana, which is the Trincomalee. So these have all been ancient ports at some point in time, and places like Mantai and Gokana, that is Mana and Trincomalee, have been in operation. We can trace this to about 2nd century before Common Era, for instance, right? So we know that happened. And so let's go to the next. Yeah, so here is a collection of small finds we have. And even if now this is from the Mantai or the Mana excavations, even if you go to the Colombo National Museums, you will easily find things from Rome. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff from China, Asian countries, but even Greek urns, Roman urns, Egyptian urns, all of this you will just, if you walk into the museum, it's already there. So it's not like unknown history, for instance. These were discovered long time ago. But it's just that it has not made it into our mainstream historical books, eventually ending up in the current way we define our identities in a very tight, compartmentalized and exclusive fashion. So here is another example of contextualizing Sri Lanka in the ancient world. Most of you will know the map of Ptolemy and map of Taprobane, which is usually what we go to or refer to. But this map of Eratosthenes predates it. And actually Taprobane draws from this, and it's one of the earliest depictions. I mean, he didn't draw this, obviously. This is a 19th century recreation of the map based on Eratosthenes' descriptions from, again, 2nd century before Common Era. And you can actually see on the right-hand side, right-hand bottom, you have the Taprobane. And what you can actually see is the island is depicted even bigger than the Indian subcontinent, if you really look at it that way, So, and what does that say? And that actually, for me, my argument is that means that for the world, the island played a very crucial role. So it was not literal about its geographical importance. It was a more figurative depiction of how important the island was in terms of trade and sea routes and all of that. So because of that, we come across a history which is full of multiculturalism, full of cosmopolitanism, and a lot of archaeologists have written about it, like Bo Hingamwa, Bo Pearachi, and Jagat Veerasinghe. So it's not, I'm not just saying these are not my findings, these are findings of other archaeologists who have written extensively on this. Even Professor Sudarshan Seneviratne, who has written on pre-Aryan, almost before the Vijaya myth and all of that, way back into the times of 6th century before Common Era. So there's a lot of information there which shows us. Now let me take you quickly through a timeline. I'm just going to hop you through. So this is from Mihintale. I hope most of you will recognize that Mihintale is a very symbolic place to especially the Sinhalese Buddhist community in the country, because that is where Arahant Mihindu, the harbinger of Buddhism, brought Buddhism to Sri Lanka. So it's very, and now in a very few days we will be celebrating Poson, the event of Mahindagamane, or the arrival of Arahant Mahinda, bringing Buddhism into the country in a next week probably. We will, it's due. But if you actually look at this Kantaka Chetya from Mihintale, and you immediately see, look into the dojans of it, you will see a figure of Ganesha right in there, a Hindu god, right? So here is a immensely Buddhicized site, or a Buddhist site. I mean, I call it Buddhicized site because for me it's incorrect to call it a Buddhist site as such. Okay, you could call it a Buddhist site, but it is more a Buddhicized site. But you have the image of Ganesha in it, which means even from the very start, even from Anuradhapura, which we usually call as a Buddhist civilization, you have these influences of Hinduism. Not even influence, you see the presence of Hinduism, and you see the fact that these are not tight compartments that we see today. It's merging together. You go into Colombo National Museum, you will see a lot of Durga images, Surya images, worshipped and belonging to the Anuradhapura period, because Hinduism really existed along that time, and as old as Buddhism was practiced in Sri Lanka. So here is another site, come way back to 7th century. 7th century common era. Now we are jumping about 500, 600 years forward. This is a place in Central Highlands called Nalanda Gedige in Matale. It's a bit mysterious site. We can't actually tell you like who built it, but the surrounding historical sources point to a fact that this could be something built by a particular king who was actually brought up in India, although who was born in the island, but because of the political conflicts, was taken to India and grew up there in the Pallava court. So grew up absorbing Pallava culture, fought with the Pallavas in their own dynastic clashes when the Pallavas were fighting the Cheras in Indian history and all of that, and then came back, and the Pallava kings actually supported him to come back and fight internal forces within Sri Lanka to claim the throne, right? And the architecturally speaking, what we see is in Nalanda is an esoteric site, which is again a mix of Hindu and Buddhist architecture. Very common features if you look at it architecturally, and also heralding a lot of tantric Buddhism, which is a very different form of Buddhism that was present in the country than the one that we know now. So why I wanted to share with you about this brief story about this Manavamma or Manavarman, as he is known in India, same character in Sri Lanka, known as King Manavamma, is that we often think of ourselves as a passive participant in all that's going on. We believe that, okay, India came and influenced our art, or like we always place ourselves at the receiving end of all these influences. And I would argue, along with people like Professor Jagat Veera Singh, who makes a very good case, so that is a wrong understanding of it. We were very much active in the regional politics, regional dynamics. We went and fought in other people's wars, so we were active. And as a result, this whole we brought the legacy of all that is the fact that we were open. We were a community that was open, that was negotiating, that was borrowing, that was being inspired by different cultures, religions, and absorbed it into our own social fabric as we moved down through history. Then we moved to 11th century. This is Polonnaruwa. That's also one place you must go and visit if you are very keen about understanding how these different identities that we are talking about today are completely in hybrid forms. I don't know how I'm doing with time, Peter. How much more time do I have? If you can give me an indicator, that would be great. But I'm going to just complete. So here we have an example of a Buddhist architecture. And here we have a typical or archetypical example of Hindu architecture. Yeah, and I'm just going to skip that. And here I'm going to talk about Tivanka, which is a Buddhist building. But if you really look at the ground plan of it architecturally, you know that it's the same as the Hindu building that you have here, right? So you cannot, even if you look at it in terms of architectural or archaeological or art historical angles, you cannot really define these identities that we know them as today historically. They were much more fluent and open. So this is Naipena Vihara, which is actually a Hindu hovin, which is now a Buddhist temple. So like as certain heritage sites move through history, they also change identity. And I mean, this is not just something that happened in Sri Lanka. You go to India, you go to places in Cambodia, all of this happened. Buddhist sites become Hindu sites, become Buddhist sites again. It has happened in Turkey, the Hagia Sophia becoming a mosque and a church and a mosque again, and all of that, and a museum and then a mosque again. So all these sites changing their identities with as history changes, but always leaving certain layers upon all of that. And to come to Kandy now, now we are in let's say 16th, 17th century almost, yeah. And this is the famous Magul Madua, which is beside the Temple of the Tooth Relic. I'm not going to fill you with too much detail on art and architectural history, but to show you how even the colonizers who came, even the British who came, who we feel we received from or we borrowed from, also it happened the other way around as well. So for instance, this is the Trinity College chapel that you will see if you go to Trinity College Kandy, and this is a chapel, for instance. So this is not a church. This is a church. This is not a temple or it's a Christian religious building, but it adopts the vernacular architecture of the Sinhala Buddhist Magul Madu, which you saw earlier. And if you know, you will see the same structure in the Independence Square in Colombo, which is a secular place, for the reason that this is the place that we actually lost our total independence in 1815, when the pact was signed between the British and the king at that time. So this is how Christianity also borrowed from other architectures. And you can see now these pagodas that you see, the wooden carvings are very, very typical of the island. And then you see also the Christian symbols being merged with it, lotuses, and instead of the rose, lotuses appearing. So you can see a complete symbiosis. Now here is, I don't know if you can immediately recognize, but this is now a temple that borrows architecture from the Western cathedral style or Baroque style, for instance. This is Kande Vihare. Now we are coming even to 18th century, 19th century. So look at the facade at Kande Vihare building. You know, you have the Greek columns, and you have the British unicorn and the British emblem adorning the temple, a Buddhist space. Yeah, so there are many places like this. Karagambitiya in Dehiwala is a very close one. Sunandarama in Ambalangoda, many, especially coastal temples that borrowed a lot heavily from Baroque architecture or Catholic architecture, even more than Christian, Anglican architecture. Yeah, so this is another one from that. So, and here I want to finish with, now this is the Jumma Miran Mosque in Gaul. And it doesn't look like, again, a mosque. It's very different from an idea of the mosque that we have. It actually borrows heavily from Baroque architecture that you would find cathedrals built in Portugal or something like that, right? But here we are. We buy and we borrow and buy and negotiate. And if you actually look at the formation of identities as a historical process, it is something in which that you negotiate by, you know. And here I don't even want to bring the which I think a very simplistic interpretation that, oh, everything was harmonious and beautiful. No, I don't think that's the correct understanding or correct thing. I do think that there was conflict among it, but there was also confluence and continuity. That is what I'm trying to show through this. Now, for instance, simply because you talked a lot about Islamic identity in your last webinar. Now, this is a tombstone discovered in Trincomalee, belonging to 14th century, by the way, which you can see if you walk into the Colombo National Museum. And this is beautiful arabesque carvings with Kufic inscriptions. You know, so Kufic being a style of writing originating from Kufa, Iraq, which is used in the writing of the Quran. Quran is written in many scripts. Kufic is one of them. There's Nastaliq, there's so many other, but Kufic is one of them. And we even find that in Sri Lanka. And this is not the only tombstone or even the first tombstone, Islamic or Kufic tombstone that we find in the island. We find about 4 more is actually displayed in Colombo Museum and dating back to about 10th century. I think one of the first. So what I wanted to leave you with is the idea that this is not to propagate a simplistic idea of that our history has been living in harmony. No, there have been giving and taking, there have been conflict, there have been confluence, and there has been continuity, through all this. And if we are able to bring these kinds of histories which are alternate or which are marginalized in a way, or which are left out just to accommodate one singular narrative of history that we learn from our school books, and even when we switch on our television and watch all these dramas that are based on kings and princesses and all of that. So if we can bring in all these evidences and start teaching a history that is a lot more inclusive, we may be on a better path in forming a more inclusive, more tolerating identities, which hopefully would regulate the kind of hate speech we are trying to deal with right now. So I think I'm sort of coming to an end. I think those are the images that I wanted to share. So without going on and on, why don't I stop there? Peter, and we start taking some questions and answers and taking it up from there.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hasini. That was great. My video has been stopped by the host, so I'm sorry if you can't see me, but I'm sure that'll be quite all right for me to be heard and not to be seen. Let me start off straight away by asking you a very a direct question. Now we are talking about countering hate speech and creating a different identity that will celebrate, that will recognize differences rather than division. My question to you, given where we are today, I mean, as you said, these identities go through changes, and we know what the British did. And I thought you might talk a little about it, but it doesn't really matter. How the British used the word race for the first time in the 1830s, when it was not even in our vocabulary. And because they wanted to have a kind of homogeneous identity for administrative purposes, they felt that the caste system, which was largely based on compulsory labor, didn't cut it for them. Whereas in India, it worked for them to work on religion and caste, because the Hindu religion was based on caste differences and all that. So let's not get into that. That's an interesting study in itself, the whole British period and the Dutch and so on, how the whole thing got changed. But my point is, we are where we are. Sinhalese identity has been created largely around the ethno-religious formulation, Sinhala Buddhist. And Hinduism, Tamil largely constructed around Hinduism. And strangely, the Moors were identified by the Dutch, I believe, rather than a religion, a group, a caste even at one point, and a religious identity, very strangely. So this is where we are. Do you see that the way forward is to turn back and look at some of those historical identities you spoke about and teaching history, or looking forward and trying to find a common identity as a human purpose, given the kind of destruction we are seeing, for example, on the planetary scale, environment, use something like that which affects all human beings and create an identity that puts us, our very future, at stake, and therefore start looking at us, at ourselves as human beings, as a part of a globe, as an organic biological system. What are your thoughts? I know I mean, to frame it.
But but I mean, I agree with
forward or do forward. Yeah, that's my question.
I mean, okay, before I come to that point of forward and backwards, I just want to say I agree with you on what the comments you made on colonialism as a part of it. Creating through all these practices like centralized administration, census and cartography and all of labeling. But even in that, if you really go into it, you also find a category that they call as Tamil Buddhist, for instance. If you go back and trace their census, there is a category called Tamil Buddhist that we don't recognize right now. Right? So even then, you see, it's not been easy to do that. You have to understand from the British perspective, they were trying to run an empire, so they didn't want to make this little island too complicated. They just wanted simple ways to understand, right? So that was their headache. And we just had to deal with all of that. Since we were at the point of independence, that was the way we've been trying to figure ourselves out. But I don't think that we should blame all of that on the British. I think maybe British created half of the problem, and the rest of it were created by our own, especially our political leaders, who used these ethnic boundaries for their political gain. So I think that is where it started.
To interrupt you, Hasini. Now, even that, for example, when they wanted to have representatives in the state council, they spoke about Burgher representation, Eurasian, Tamil, and Sinhalese. So they started bringing this. Now, if you go slightly back to the Kandyan kingdom, Nayakars, and the Dutch tried to say they are foreign, but the rebellion didn't catch on because some of the others they foisted upon them had to have a Nayaka background to even pose themselves as alternative kings. So my point is, the British did bring it to the political system where they started finding representation for state council based on what they categorized as race. So I just wanted to interject. And then that continued as to what should be race. And then the disenfranchisement of 1 million plantation workers, because that will change the composition in parliament and power and these British state systems of governance. So I just wanted to make, that we should underestimate also the role the British played in bringing that form of governance. And perpetrate that, because you're still carrying that damn parliamentary system, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. But coming back to your more philosophical and interesting question about should we look forward or should we look back? I mean, it's one of those fundamental questions that everyone asks. So, I mean, for me, I look at it like this, you know, the future is blank. You know, we know that we need to create an inclusive identity. And I mean, where you place it, whether you want to place it on a national level or at a planetary level is again, you know, a call that you and I can talk for a long time. But my point would be that you cannot do something or you cannot imagine on a blank page. You know, you need to look back at your history, because you need to understand your present if you want to also move into your future, right? And if you look at the history in a way that serves your present more positively than in a way that excludes, that discriminates, that leads to conflict, then you are in a better place to imagine an identity for your future, which is a lot more inclusive, based on values. Now, I mean, for instance, I always ask people are talking about a Sri Lankan identity. But what does it mean? What does it mean to have a Sri Lankan identity? You know, I mean, it is just not enough to say, oh, Sri Lankan identity, and it just happens. You have to define what it is. What does it mean to be Sri Lankan, right? What are the values that we say? Like, why do I call myself a Sri Lankan? Is it just because I was born geographically in this island, or is there something more, right? So I think you cannot, in a sense, decouple a history of a country or a place from the way they define themselves now. Just as much we cannot do that personally. You know, I mean, Hasini cannot define herself, or Peter cannot define himself if you have a particular childhood onwards. You know, you are because of your history, right? So
let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you because you see, history as defined by who, and you know we are up against it when you try to the very idea of rewriting history. So I'll give you an example of how, you know, depending on what interest it serves for you to identify yourself in a particular way. Now, I was very closely associated with Bala Tampo and the trade union movement and the Ceylon Mercantile Union. One of the things that was, you know, enshrined, which is not probably practiced now, and Bala used to always say, we think of ourselves as human beings first. Then we think of ourselves as working people. And only then we think of ourselves as members of the Ceylon Mercantile Union. Now, in that formulation, there is no reference to Sinhala Tamil Buddhists, because it served our purpose as working people who are being completely exploited to have that identity. It just didn't matter. And just to drive home that point, so when there was a incident in 1983, when there was a supervisor in a factory, a Tamil supervisor, who was a tyrant, and he served the management. And when the mobs came to attack, the Sinhala workers who faced the brunt of this man's, you know, anti-working class actions and hostility saved him because of that training. Because they said, our dispute with him is based on a completely different matter, not because he's a Tamil, but because he chooses to serve the interest of the management and exploitation, and they protected him. So I'm saying that kind of formulation based on the greater good of people would be more practical, don't you think, rather than trying to rewrite that history, I mean, that's an impossible task, isn't it? Given where we are, the strong sense of singular and all of that. I mean, I'm just trying to see as a part of the discussion of country, and then trying to
Well,
get identity, looking forward.
well, I think independent of your and my opinion, history will be made in the whole world. I mean, you can't just wish away history. It's going to be written. You switch on Netflix and you see so much history there, and everyone is in the act of telling and retelling history. You and I might not agree. Okay. It is true. I see where your frustration comes from, because you cannot establish a truth in history. That's correct. You cannot. You have to get rid of this whole obsession about things like authenticity. What is true? Singular narratives. This is the only truth and no other truth. You cannot understand history that way. Right? So it's not just about writing a different history, but also changing our own imagination of what history actually is, and really understanding that history is not about truths. It's about multiple truths. It's about multiple voices, right? We have only now, so far we've only thought of kings, an elite history. What about what kind of stories could we tell if we start thinking of it from a different angle, from the angle of women, from the angle of farmers, just like what you are talking about, right? We can say it is not helpful to look back at history, but people are not going to stop doing it because it's so important to their identity. You cannot. I mean, things like religion, things like history, things like language, these are all part of what makes us a cultural being, and we can't just wish that away. And it feeds into the thing. And what I also feel is that if you the approach I took, especially in this research that I have done, it's actually the art historical approach, because I felt that promotes appreciation more than anything else. Appreciation that comes from deeper understanding of the other practices, other traditions, and understanding the connections between us and other traditions that surround us, right? So from a deeper understanding comes a deep levels of empathy, which allows us to reconfigure us in a different way. So that was why I took a particularly art historical approach. Sure. You could do it through literature, you could do it through so many other ways, but yeah.
So let me throw another example at you about, so that we understand about now take one particular group. So now take the Tamil speaking people. Now, take say in 83. Now, okay, let's take this 4th of February. While there was a big military parade celebrating independence, there was also a very interesting development taking place in the eastern province, where people were walking to establish the rights of the Tamil-speaking people. And in the hill country, there was a struggle going on for the 1,000 rupee wage of the plantation workers. So there were different identities on the same day when we were celebrating independence from the British, where they had completely different ideas of what independence was. Now, even if you take that, if you take the Tamil-speaking people, even now, you saw what happened in Jaffna when the LTT drove away the Muslim Tamil-speaking people from the north and eastern provinces with an 8-hour notice. Now, these are Tamil-speaking people. It's nothing to do with history in that sense, because these people lived there for over 500 years, the Muslims there. And also in 83, when there were riots, and this really shocked me, that my friends were affected and they went into the refugee camps. And in the refugee camps, when they were all common victims of attacks by mobs, I don't call them singular people, organized mobs, in the refugee camps, there were differences based on they are not northern Jaffna Tamil people. They are from Malayar, the hill country, or even eastern province Tamils. There was a hierarchy. And they
yes, so that hierarchy is historical. That hierarchy is historical. It's a historical construct.
That's
Yeah,
right.
so yeah, and even the whole idea of the Tamil speaking, or like if you take Sinhalese nationalism and Tamil nationalism together, right? Like these are historical processes. You cannot just take them as Sinhala nationalism and Tamil nationalism and explain them. You have to understand them in context, especially in their socio-historical and cultural context. How did it evolve out of the colonial, colonial experience? So like I think a lot of the phenomena that we see today, we cannot take them away and understand them by themselves. You have to understand them in the bigger context. All phenomena, just like this Ravana and Balakaya and Ravana, Balakaya, and all these extreme essentialist Sinhalese groups that are coming. All of these have to be understood as a part of a process, and these groups are rewriting history. Like you and I may not try to rewrite history or present it, but the other groups are doing it. The Tamil nationalists are doing it. The Sinhalese nationalists are doing it in very, very creative, very, very good ways. And they are using social media, they are using film, they are using all these kinds of very communicative, very catchy instruments in spreading their narrative. And the civil society, or you and I, who believe in not even national identities, but we dream of planetary identities, we are not so good at doing that. That's the point. Yeah, we are not so good at presenting alternative narratives to counter those narratives. That's it. So countering hate speech, for me, to come back to the original topic, is also countering those narratives and giving alternative narratives that leads to discrimination and hatred.
Okay, before I come back, there is a question on how do places like Khattaragama come to exist, where Hinduism and Buddhism have come to be practiced alongside one another, with people of both faiths coming to worship gods across both faiths. Yeah.
Yes. So again, this is very, very common. Like you can immediately trace this back to Kandyan kingdoms, right? Look at Kandy, see how multicultural it is. Just like Khattaragama, that is there today. Kandy, you see the Buddhist temple, and then the devalas, which are immediately the Hindu devalas around it. So these are all very syncretic. Sometimes people don't like to use that word, so I use the word confluent spaces, or hybrid spaces, where all of it comes together. And look at the way people are actually practicing religion now. So all these ideologies exist at a more political level, right? Essentialist political level. But if you really come to the way people practice religion right now, today, in Khattaragama, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter which god you are praying to when your child is sick. So I don't really, the fact that I'm a Buddhist, or it doesn't really matter. So there are enough Buddhists who go to the Kovi, and the Kovi is inside the temple. So this has been there historically. I just showed you since Polonnaruwa, since about 11th century. So Khattaragama has a long history. It's not just a sudden phenomenon. It has been our practice all along. And if you really go and trace areas of Khattaragama, Panama, those areas, you will find extremely interesting groups of people. Now in Panama, a lot of research has been done of the mixed marriages that happen between the Sinhalese and the Tamil, and actually you can't divide them as such because they are so mixed. That's not the only area. You go to the Mana side, Battalangundu, all of that, Tamil speaking Sinhalese origin. So it's all mixed. So the reality of life and practice is, you can easily see the hybridity that you see in Khattaragama, where you have Buddhist, Hindu gods, all of it coming together. Why? Because this is the impact or the result of the true historical process that has always been this mixed, right? The essentialist narratives are created by by certain groups, right? Then we bring and present a version of Dutugamunu Elara myth in keeping with a particular ideology in the books. Then you start creating a certain exclusive nationalism, right? You then bring you appropriate a figure like Ravana, which is completely original product. We can't even claim Ravana to be ours, but we take it, we appropriate that, and we fit it into a certain ideology, and create these narratives. These are all political ideology. But if you look at the practice, like in Kataragama, it's always been hybrid.
Okay, so coming back to this question of, so the fact is that identities are important, correct, for existence. We cannot, we need to find groups of people that's part of human existence, isn't it? So my question is,
yeah, if you follow the philosophers, no. If you follow the philosophers like Jesus Christ and Buddha and all of that, they will ask you to, transcend your identities and go beyond. But I mean, in the context that we are talking, yeah, politically speaking, identities are important.
I mean, it's some grouping, no? I mean, you can't exist, of course, in ultimate Buddhism. I mean, if you reach that point, then we're all good. But I mean, where there is no shunya, you are no one. So that's a different point. I'm saying even where we are, human race functions on base of some groupings, some interests, whatever that may be. It can be very small, it can be large. Now, my point is, I appreciate, I'm not in any way underestimating the historical role. I'm saying, should be in terms of reinforcing the fact that there were the Tamil, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying erase history, no. I'm saying, given where we are, given that there is massive income inequality, right, which is what we are forgetting, and that is why some of those divisions are being exacerbated, because people are using these types of identities to say there are these guys taking away your jobs, or you're doing poorly because those guys are taking, you know what I'm trying to say, university admission and so on. So while I understand that, given that the world is now so polarized economically, shouldn't we look at, rather than say there were the Tamils and there were the Sinhalese and they live together, and people go to Kataragama, they see this, but they don't become less racist just because they've gone and experienced the fact that the Sinhalese and Muslims are worshipping, Sinhalese and Tamils are worshipping, common premises there. There are very people who could come out and be as racist as the others, although they've just experienced that historical confluence. My point is, shouldn't we try to create, rather than re-establish those identities, shouldn't we make a different attempt while doing all of that to create new identities that will help us transcend those and try to create a better, a human identity in that sense, a purpose or something like that. I'm just
I totally agree with you, Peter, and I don't think, I think it will be, what I was trying to present was not to re-establish the identities, but actually to challenge them, completely, even dismantle them, right? So that was what those slides that I presented to you about, because you cannot understand these identities don't work when you take it to Polo Narua or even before Common Era, right? So these identities, actually the point is completely showing how inadequate these modern identity categories are in understanding the past, right? Because we use the past all the time to define these identities. That is the argument that we are trying to revert, right? Okay. So it's really not about finding better ways to describe what is Tamil and what is Sinhalese. No, not at all. It's actually dismantling and deconstructing that identity and showing you belong to a bigger region, you belong to a bigger world, So it's actually coming to what you were talking about, establishing a planetary thing. So now think of the future of Sri Lanka. right? Do we don't, we are still struggling. Oh, now economically, what are we going to do? Like, I mean, Bangladesh is also now better than us in terms of exporting garments. So even like if you come to a economic discussion, which probably we don't have time here today, we have no economic vision, right? But
Okay. Sorry,
if
I'm
you
sorry.
really look at the history, you have a role that Sri Lanka has played throughout time that gives it edge over the others,
Yeah.
So
I
yeah,
see the connection. I see the connection. Thank you. There are
Mm.
two questions on Q&A, and then I also found there were some comments on chat, which I didn't want to read because, you might read it. But there are two questions on, and also on chat now. First question from Fazia Ibrahim. What steps would you suggest to have? What steps would you suggest to have an inclusive syllabus in school textbooks, such as history and art? So, and there are three other questions. If you can keep it relatively
very short, yeah,
without
so
without taking the content
yes,
away, what you have to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, I believe it has to start by putting together an inclusive group of experts who could come up with something like that. Or you bring two parties. If you go and look at the way NIE is designing curriculum now, it's only single sitting there. So how can you come with an inclusive syllabus, right? So those things really need to change. So in order to write more inclusive histories, you need to create a round table which allows more diverse voices in that process. So process is very important, not just the output or the final syllabus. To keep it very short.
Okay, so she also said inclusive syllabus in school textbooks such as history and art, some specific. So these are broadly covered. Start that process with an inclusive group. Is that what you are suggesting, Hasini?
Yes, yeah. Okay. And like art and history, I mean, art history. So there's history, there's art history, there's archaeology. The other way is to really stop teaching all these things in separate ways, separate subjects. Again, another legacy of Western thinking and dichotomies and colonialism that we carry forward. I mean, if you look at all the transformative educational theories that the West is adopting right now, they are doing away with subjects, because you cannot, by dividing things into different subjects, you lose the overall picture. To understand something, you need to bring the art historical, the archaeological, the historical, the sociological, the anthropological all together. So to go for a more multidisciplinary form of education would be my short answer for that.
Excellent, excellent. So there's another one. Can you also shed some light into how conflicts arise when attempts are made to exclusively claim sites of religious syncretism?
Okay, short answer. Come again, please repeat the question. Please repeat the question.
So can you also shed some light into how conflicts arise when attempts are made to exclusively claim sites of religious syncretism? In fact, I'm not familiar with that.
Familiar with the term, yes. Syncretism is, well, it has two connotations. Syncretism is hybridity, but there are also academics who claim that there is a power dynamism attached to it. As in, syncretic is something that you force me to take up, so then I become syncretic from an external influence. So there are two interpretations of syncretism. Sorry, I don't have to really have time. I'm trying to keep it very short. But yes, this happens because Sri Lanka, I mean, if you look at our modern history, it's always been ethnic outbidding, right? We try to put claim upon a claim. Right? Kuragala is a fantastic example of how this happened, which is both a Muslim site and a Buddhist site, right? And by the way, Sri Lanka is not the only place that it's happening right now. Think of Hagia Sophia, that example in Turkey, right? Now the fundamental Islamic groups want to make it a mosque again. Right? It was a mosque, a church, a mosque, and a museum, and now again a mosque, right? So this is the nature of heritage sites. They go through time. For a historian, this is natural. It will be claimed by one group and the other group, and who can claim what? It's going to be a conflict. So if you need a reason to have a fight, then you can fight over the heritage site or a cow, as in the case of Ayodhya and in India. So this is how we scapegoat everything around us when we need to fight. That's the point, right? So I would put it that way. I can go into a much longer elaboration, but I don't think we have the time, Peter.
So there are two questions from ICS Colombo, and there is another. So I'll take one of them because there's another question from Suramya. So I'll take one question of ICS, and if there aren't any, we can go back to that. So maybe I'll pick the second one because you spoke about history. Who do we go to as sources of history? We see some Tamils not willing to accept the archaeology department's findings, while some Sinhalese not willing to accept oral traditions and sources of the Tamils. So where do we turn to find the real origins of the story?
There is no real origins of the story. It's simple as that.
That's right.
It is. Yeah, I mean, this is what I was trying to say. History should never be about finding the truth. You cannot find the truth about something that happened in 2nd century before Common Era. It is not possible. There are certain assumptions that you can arrive at based on certain archaeological evidences, right? But archaeologists are making assumptions about it with the insufficient data that they have. Historians are trying to do that by looking at different historical sources, be it Mahavamsa or the Tamil sources or the literature of the Dravidian literature in the South Indian period or whatever, right? So literary sources. That's how historians do it. Art historians do it by looking at the temples and the architecture and the art and try to read it through. So there are multiple ways of reading history. That's the other thing. Not based our very narrow way of understanding history only through text of Mahavamsa. This is not helpful. You have to really get out of that one book, one story perspective, look at multiple sources, which are not just historical documentation, but archaeological documentation, art historical documentation, art, all of that. When you bring that together, you see a better story. Though I won't claim that to be a complete story, and I don't think that's the way we should approach history, to see a complete or a true story. This is not possible.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Suramya. Do you think we can use language lessons in our classrooms to delve into hate speech?
Actually, yes. Because I've been doing this. I'm sorry. I'm going to take maybe two minutes, Peter. I can't say this very well.
There aren't any other questions.
Okay.
And you're still 16 minutes.
Yeah. So, because language is such an important component of culture. History is one, religion is one, language is another dimension, and a lot of the hate speech is based on language, and understanding and identifying those idioms and languages are very important. For instance, I used to do this exercise within the universities in Sri Lanka, right, where I go and I sit with a group of university students and ask them to actually identify the words they call each other. Girls call boys and boys call girls within the university. Universities have a subculture which also have a sub-language of their own, right? I mean, outsiders may not understand all this terminology of podda or alaya and all these terms, right? And so you have words like badua, gediya for calling girls. This is how boys call girls, right? And then girls have another set of terminology for boys called kukula and all of these terms. But this is real, I've done it, and they come up with it, and then I get them to reflect. Just think what it is. You call a girl badua. What does it mean? Badua means a thing. A thing is something that you use and you don't need it, you just throw it away. So what is the thinking behind it? So I think if you're countering hate speech and you're working with hate speech, getting to understand how, really understanding deep meanings, hierarchies, discriminations that are embedded in the languages that we speak, which we often take for granted, like sexist jokes, for instance. I'm not saying, I understand sexist jokes, right? But I also think we need to reflect on it, right? Looking at those practices, which are very anthropological exercise for me, at least, when I was working with these students, to reflect on the language they use on each other and use in their behavior, and understanding the power dynamics that underlie there was a very important exercise. Was a very transformative exercise for them, because they never had thought like that. They had never thought. They called their girlfriend Badua, but they never thought what did Badu actually mean, right? So I mean, that kind of thinking sort of helps. I mean, I saw, you know, a lot of people wagging their head. I don't know if they stopped calling the other that, but at least I think there was a point made there.
Great. I think since we have time, I'll go to that question from ICS. We have several contested sacred sites in the north and east, and we have seen this very apparent through media reporting, where one site is portrayed totally differently. Is accepting a shared history the way forward? If so, would it be really possible in Sri Lanka, where there are several tensions over sacred sites, especially in the north and east? Clear?
Yeah, very clear. So that is where it becomes very important for archaeologists to work with anthropologists, I would say, you know, because history, we are not doing this as an abstract exercise in an abstract space, right? Maybe what you are trying to put forward about it is based on evidence and all of that. Kandarode, for instance, one of those contested sites in the north that is claimed to be Buddhist and could also be proven to be Buddhist, but now it's in a thing. But that is absolutely the responsibility of the historian, the archaeologist, to understand the dynamics and the politics of the present moment and present audience, that they are bringing their theories, their findings, and presenting their findings, and what is the impact of that theory that they're putting forward on their audiences. So this, for me, is advocating for responsibility on the part of the historian, part of the archaeologist, part of the media, which should represent all that. Because history doesn't happen in a vacuum. And most of the time, the history you say depends not so much on what happened in 2nd century BCE, but what is happening right now, right? So if we were friends of the Tamil, the story we say about Dutugamunu and Elara would not be the same. I will tell you that. You know, it'll be different. But so history is often a reflection of the current moment and current dynamics between groups, hierarchies, and political dynamics.
Okay, and a question about identity. And no, let me check if there are any other questions. Nabila, are there any other questions that I'm missing out on chat and so on?
Actually, no, we have shared everything, even from the Facebook Live on the chat. So you're seeing them all right now.
Now, just shifting from ethno-religious to gender, Hasini, how do you see identities in the gender space? So you just broaden this. I know that might not be a very specific area that you're working on in terms of the area that you really focus on your research, but could you share some thoughts? Because this is such a prevalent problem, isn't it? Gender identity, or even the normative masculine, feminine gender, and then the repression against women. Where do we see hope in that issue? Or is that something that you want to say very specific to? I can appreciate that, but I'm just wondering.
I mean, I don't want to make general comments on that.
Education, I'm just wondering if you can make a connection between education and some way of looking at gender differently.
No, I mean, that's why I gave you the example of working with those university students, right? I mean, through that language exercise, I was actually working with gender-based discriminations, right? So, I mean, you have to, like, I believe all of these things happen together. You know, you can't separate this ethnicity from religious identity or gender identity. Most of it act together, and as and when they come up, you have to deal with it. But rather than commenting it differently, my interest is more in understanding again how these have been formed historically, and a lot of the gender, the stereotypes of gender or morality, for instance, is again something that we inherit. So very much from the Victorian British, right? And if you really go back, we know that in the Kandyan kingdom, we had different practices of polyandry, for instance, which is very uncommon in the world, where a woman was allowed two husbands. Not that I'm showing it as a feminist victory or anything like that, but it was the gender identities were formulated differently. Marriage and all of these gender relationships were configured differently. I mean, the way we can understand them is through actually reading a lot of literature, and people like Justin Henry, I know, have done a lot of literature research on erotic literature from the Kandyan period and how that reflects gender dynamics, for instance, for people who are interested, who can go and find out. But a lot of the baggage that we have to deal with right now, and we have to cut now, is actually inherited by Victorian morality and part of our education, the convent education, most of us, Christian education, most of us also received in a certain way. It has to be dealt with, and hopefully through education, through media, through cultural productions, they play a very important role in tackling that issue.
And also, again, identity in terms of fear and insecurity. I mean, isn't that where a lot of the problem lies? For example, the Sinhala majority had this minority complex of, the Tamils have a much bigger space in South India and all of that. And this is the only country we have. And, isn't that coming from a sense of social insecurity rather than some historic or some deep-rooted, identity of being Sinhalese or Tamil? And for example, the Muslims, they're taking away our business, completely lacking in data, but a fear and a sense of insecurity that's making them very, having this very strong views about, hatred and so on.
Yeah. My question would be, yes, that's true. But my question is, how does these fears trigger so easily? They trigger so easily, or plummet so easily into violence because of the background of discrimination and attitude, that whole exclusivist identities that we are so used to. Because we are used to calling the Muslims, certain words that I don't want to use, and that signals a way of looking at that group of people, right? So when that is there since your childhood, you absorb that through your school books or whatever, and then absorb it through the media that you watch and the teledramas that you watch, and then you have a chat with your friend, and they talk about, okay, our business is being taken away, then it happens. But a certain incident by itself cannot trigger it. It only gets triggered because it has the necessary environment that has been built, again, for much longer than just that incident. So all these things, I mean, just take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that you see reported. It is the same. It is the same majority-minority mindsets, things, incidents triggering violence. But it happens in that larger context, which makes it possible.
Yeah, and I lost a train of thought because I was so closely following your discussion. It's on this fear.
Yeah, because what I mean is, if our discriminatory mindset wasn't on at the moment, and you tell me, my business is being taken over by these guys, I wouldn't react the same way. I wouldn't say yes. I would ask you why, but how do you know whatever, But if I already have a discriminatory mindset, I'll immediately say yes. Then we are together. We are two. We are three. We are a mob, and then we go and So this is how. This is why I say the long-term mindset that is nurtured through a process of socialization, through education, through your, your background, through your general culture that you inhabited, through media and all of that, is also important. They play and they give the backdrop for all these fears to become triggers.
So 4 minutes to go. I don't see any other questions. So my last question to you is these divisions among Sinhalese and Tamil, if you just want to stay with that for the moment as an example, is it as prevalent as we think it is? By and large, are Sinhalese people and Tamil people left to themselves so full of hatred to one another? Given a situation, wouldn't they come? For example, I used it last time also. In the 83 riots, it was the large numbers of Sinhalese people who saved Tamil lives. And these were organized mobs and a few others who joined them. If there's a flood in a Tamil area or a Sinhala area, people would come to contribute. And now with COVID, people are reaching out irrespective of language to see where are the hospitals that need tests, ventilators, and so on. And there is a general feeling of people who are affected by this virus, which is completely non-discriminatory, and those who are not. So are we kind of exaggerating the problem to some extent? Isn't there much goodness out there? And are we overplaying this? And rather than seek that common goodness, which will bring people together, are we part of the problem in the way we are structuring these narratives as deep divisions within our society, merely because they're reflected in election or in a particular hotspot? Is that the way to look at our society? Isn't there a different way to look at it? Aren't we more kinder than we really make ourselves out to be?
Yes, and that is why I said, that is why the title of this presentation is Shared History. So focus on the shared history, focus on the positive. We are not doing that enough. I agree with you. But people, it's not a question about reflecting on whether people are good or bad by themselves. That's a long philosophical discussion, right? We know there is no answer to that. People are not good or bad by themselves, right? They act, again, my previous point, they act in a given situation, triggered by certain things that they are conditioned to. Right. So in my own professional experience of bringing groups across the conflict, bringing Tamil students from Jaffna University and Sinhalese students from Kalaniya and Colombo and Peradeniya together, where the groups even included former ex-combatants from the north and people who had their own brothers who lost their lives fighting in the army, come together after a long process of dialogue and negotiation, and also taking them to some of these places, heritage sites, to relook at themselves and trying to help them to look at themselves through a different lens, managed to come to a point where they actually accepted and hugged each other. I mean, for me, that was personally in my professional life, that was a highlight, that moment when the Sinhalese girl with a brother who died in the army hugged a former ex-combatant. So it's possible. But it doesn't happen in the background, in an environment that breeds hate speech and discrimination and hatred. And a lot of that stuff, a lot of the time, our media, our education, our cultural productions like theater and film and all of that, they are not doing that job on projecting the positive. What makes news is often conflict. We find peace boring. We find shared histories and the beautiful stories. They don't often make news. And so I agree with you there. We should focus on the positive and promote the positive stories, so that it gives models for people to also relate to and work on, and without always focusing on the conflict. I think media has a huge role and needs to configure itself so radically in thinking through those things.
So we're very, very fine. It's all 7 o'clock, just on that point. So should we have more discussions on the opposite of hate speech? Just a very quick answer. Because a lot of the things you're talking about,
I mean, let me
extreme violence, hate speech, and those are some of the things that we ourselves, some of our groups, are very focused on. One would think that we are, and I said this before, and I want to repeat for the new, are we fishing in troubled waters? Are we ourselves, our existence and subsistence depend on us as much as the media profits? Do we also profit? by speaking on these subjects, violent extremism, hate speech, conflict, should we also change our narratives in our own organizations? And talk about very short answer.
I'll give you a removed answer.
Excellent.
Okay, not directly on this context, but from another, because I'm reminded of it because we are talking about Sputnik all the time now, because of the Sputnik injection. But there's a story I know about the word Sputnik. If you actually search for the meaning, what does Sputnik mean in Russian? Now the injection is called Sputnik, but also before that, the satellite was called Sputnik, right? But do you know what the actual meaning of Sputnik is? Sputnik or Sputnitsa, which is the female form of it, is actually in Russian. It means the partner who will share a journey with you without ever leaving. So that's why they called it Sputnik, the satellite, because the satellite will forever orbit the moon without ever leaving it and sharing the journey of the moon around the planet. So the Sputnik will never leave the moon, So Sputnik and Sputnitsa is in fact actual terms that in Russian younger generation, you call each other for your boyfriend, boyfriend and girlfriend. So it's a loving term that they used in that context, which, by the way, is a transformation, because earlier the term was, I can't remember the exact terms now. I must say, I'm not an expert in Russian language as such, but I know this example. It meant something like husband and wife, which was more denoting ownership and hierarchy and all of that. And what the younger generation of poets in Russia did was to cast away these old terms of man and woman, husband and wife, and start introducing the term Sputnik, right? Which is about love, which is about equality, right? And then we have Sputnik today. I just want to give you, end with that.
I would love to end with that, but there's one question that has come in, and I don't want to, I know it's 7 o'clock with your permission, Nabila, because Kamal Shashendra has sent it both on Q&A, and so I know it's always nice to end on a lovely note, but I don't want to take anything away from him. He says, why is it in Sri Lanka that university philosophy departments do not focus on Islamic studies and Catholic studies, and within brackets philosophy? And he says, thank you for the discussion. Familiar with that? Philosophy department focusing on
I must admit, I have not researched into it. So I am not aware of how philosophy is taught in Sri Lankan universities at the moment. So I am not the best person to answer that question, but I'm not surprised, because that's the way history is taught in a very exclusivist manner. So I won't have a hard time believing what you say, because a lot of the history would be, I don't know, but again, I am not an expert on that subject and field, and I don't have enough evidence to talk or give you a satisfactory answer. I can get back to you after consulting some people that I know who know better, if that's okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hasini. It was a very fine discussion. I learned a lot today from what you presented. Thank you for that. I'm sure the other participants likewise would have gained a lot from this. And I like the map that you showed and tried to make the point that we are much bigger people than the size of our country. And that's a fabulous thought, to think that we are part of a much larger system of humanity and even beyond. And I hope, as hopeless as it might sound, that we can and we will reach deep within ourselves and see ourselves as for what we truly are and what we are capable of. And maybe, at least in the next generation, that we will find a better, a more kinder, and a more gentler society in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much, Hasini. Over to you, Nabila.
Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. We appreciate the time you have spent with us and also for supporting our series. Thank you, Hasini Haputhanthri, for presenting and Peter De Almeida for moderating our sessions. Do stay tuned for our remaining sessions and register if you already haven't for the last 2 lessons of our series on how to think critically in the digital age, hosted by the youth organization #Generation. And we hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.